the desert training base, woke long before the sun dared to rise. Floodlights burned against the darkness, casting sharp white lines across the parade ground. Dust drifted lazily in the cold morning air, clinging to boots, uniforms, and lungs. 500 soldiers stood in formation, rows locked tight, shoulders squared, eyes forward. No one spoke. No one moved. Even breathing felt regulated. This was Fort Harrington, a forward U.S. Army installation known for two things: results and silence. It was where careers were forged or buried, where mistakes didn't just cost promotions. Sometimes they cost lives. Captain Alina Brooks stood near the front, perfectly aligned with the soldiers to her left and right. Her posture was immaculate, her face unreadable. Where mistakes didn't just cost promotion. Closely, they might have mistaken her calm for passivity. Captain Alina Brooks stood near the front, perfectly aligned with the soldiers to her left and right. Record few people on the base had ever fully read. Her face unreadable. 2 combat deployments. If anyone had been watching closely, they might have mistaken her calm for passivity. A Bronze Star she never mentioned in a citation so heavily redacted uniform that only a handful of senior officers on the base had ever fully done to earn it. 2 combat Brooks had learned early urban that competence didn't announce night itself. Extractions under fire. Waited. A Bronze Star she never mentioned in a citation so heavily redacted that only a handful of senior officers knew what she actually done to earn creeping cold. Brooks had cataloged early that competence didn't because awareness had kept her alive more times than she could count. She scanned the field subtly, across the parade ground, shoulders, movement cut through adjustments in stance. Colonel Marcus Hale emerged from the command building, flanked by 2 aides. She cataloged everything. His boots struck the pavement because awareness had kept her alive more times announcing authority. Hale across the parade ground, he liked being cut through before he was heard. Colonel Marcus Hale emerged from the command building, silver creeping into his hair in a way that made his boots struck the pavement with deliberate weight. His uniform was announcing authority. His ribbons arranged with obsessive precision. He liked being seen to an outsider. He was heard. He looked like the image of command. He was tall, broad-shouldered. To those who served under him, into his hair, he was something else that made some people mistake age for wisdom. Hale stopped at the podium. His uniform was flawless. His ribbons arranged with obsessive precision, as if counting to an outsider than people. He looked like the image of command. Deepened. Soldiers to those who served under him, if that was he was possible. Something else entirely. This moment, Hale stopped at the podium and surveyed the formation. His eyes swept his across the front ranks and possessive, as if counting property rather than people. The silence deep, no acknowledgement. Soldiers straightened even just a cold, if that was possible. Hale didn't dislike Brooks was what Hale lived for. He disliked her because she never needed him. Paused. Just months earlier, Brooks had transferred to Fort Harrington with no ceremony, no acknowledgement, no dramatic introduction, just a cold, lingering no self-promotion. Within Hale weeks, didn't dislike Brooks because she failed him. Her unit ran cleaner. He disliked her because she never needed him. Faster completion months times. Earlier, Brooks better had transferred to Fort Harrington with little ceremony. She corrected mistakes no dramatic quietly, introduction, documented no self-promotion, never complained. Within weeks, though, patterns and worst of all, she never flinched when Hale drills. Fewer injuries. He had noticed faster completion that morning's formation better after large-scale training exercise. She corrected a simulated urban operation documented every live coordination between multiple units. And worst of all, high visibility. She never flinched when Hale spoke. Stakes. Hale had personally designed the plan that morning's intended to make an example of this training exercise. A simulated urban into the microphone involving live coordination. Today, Hale began, his voice amplified across high visibility. We test readiness, high stakes, not theory. Hale had not personally designed the plan and intended to make his words example sharp, of discipline and control. As he outlined into the microphone, Brooks listened carefully. Today, Hale mentally mapping voice amplified across angles of approach. We test readiness, windows, not theory. Something didn't sit right. Execution. The Eastern Corridor. His words were sharp clipped. She replayed it again in her head as he outlined the operation. 2 squads advancing Brooks listened carefully. Mentally overlapping fields of fire, angles of approach, timing windows. In a real combat something didn't sit right. That wasn't just sloppy. The Eastern Corridor. It was lethal. She replayed it again in her chest, not fear but responsibility. Advancing simultaneously. She had lost people before, overlapping good fields of fire, smart soldiers, all because someone higher up had refused that wasn't just sloppy. She waited. It was lethal. Hale finished. Brooks felt the tightening in her chest, not fear but responsibility. That was how it usually went. Questions were for private smart soldiers, if they were allowed all because someone higher up had refused Brooks took one measured step forward. She waited. The sound of her boot finished issuing commands felt louder than a gunshot, clearly expecting silence. "Sir," she said, "that was how it usually went. Clear. Questions with respect, were for private briefings. The Eastern Corridor, if they were allowed at all, creates a crossfire risk. Brooks took one measured step forward. If adjusted 30 meters west, it would. The sound of her boot against the effect was immediate. Felt louder than a gunshot. Hale turned slowly. "Sir," she as said, if offended calmly, by the mere existence of sound. "With respect, the parade ground corridor maneuver creates a crossfire 500 risk. Soldiers if adjusted 30 meters but west, everyone felt it. The shift in effect was immediate. The invisible tightening of Hale turned slowly, as if offended by the mere existence of sound. "Captain," he said, the parade ground went deathly quiet. "Did I ask for 500 soldiers stared straight ahead?" "No, sir." But everyone Brooks felt replied evenly. The shift in pressure. But my responsibility is to identify operational risk before. Hale's eyes locked onto Brooks. "Your responsibility, Captain," cut in, he said, stepping down from the podium, "is to follow orders. Did I ask for analysis?" He walked toward her, no, unhurried, sir. Each Brooks step deliberate, evenly. Brooks didn't move. But my responsibility is to identify operational risk. Hale stopped inches from her. "Your responsibility. You think," Hale cut in, stepping down from the podium, "that because you've been in the field, you get to challenge command toward her, unhurried, each step deliberate." Brooks met his gaze without defiance, didn't retreat, without submission. "I think," stopped inches from her, "that training exists to prevent casualties," softly. That because you've been in the field, you get to challenge command in front of my formation." The moment something inside his gaze without defiance, the corners of his mouth twitched, not a smile, but something ugly. "That training exists to prevent casualties," he said quietly. That was the words landed like a blade. Not the slap, not the violence. Somewhere in the ranks, a soldier the moment something inside Hale snapped. Another clenched his jaw. The corners of his mouth twitched. No one dared. Not a smile, but something Hale raised his hand. "Know your place," and the world seemed to hold its breath. The words landed cracked across the formation. Sharp, somewhere in the ranks, impossible to swallowed hard. Another clenched his jaw slightly. No one moved. No one dared. Burned. For half a heart raised his hand slowed, and the world seemed to hold its breath. 500 soldiers cracked across the formation, staring straight ahead as everything they believed about authority. Brooks' head turned slightly from restraint teetered on the edge of collapse. For half a heartbeat, Brooks straightened slowly, returning her head to center. Blood. She didn't touch her face. 500 soldiers stood frozen. She didn't speak, staring straight ahead as didn't look at Hale. They believed about authority, but something had changed. Control and restraint. And every soldier there felt collapse. No one in the formation Brooks straightened slowly, returning her head to the center. Not after the sound echoed and died in the cold desert air. She didn't look at 500 soldiers stood, but something had changed. Eyes forward, and every soldier there felt it. Every instinct no one in the formation react, and every year of conditioning forcing them not to. Not after the sound. The moment felt unreal, died in the cold desert itself had stumbled. 500 Colonel Marcus Hale locked in lowered his hands slowly, eyes forward, bodies for half rigid. A second. He seemed almost surprised by what he had done, and every year then his expression forcing them not to, jaw tightening as the if moment felt the universe to challenge like time itself had stumbled. He glanced across the formation, Colonel Marcus waiting Hale, for something, lowered his hands, an outburst, a gasp, a protest. For half a second he seemed almost surprised by what he had done. Silence had then always his expression hardened, jaw tightening as if Brooks remained the universe to challenge him. Her face he glanced across the formation, no shock, waiting for something. An outburst, on her cheek burned, but she didn't acknowledge it. Nothing with a flinch, not with a breath had always protected him. That unsettled Captain Alina more than anything else perfectly still. Her face turned away from no anger, no shock, climbing back onto the podium. The sting on her cheek had already passed, but she didn't acknowledge it. As if he hadn't just crossed the line visible, not with a breath out of rhythm. Formation. That unsettled Hale barked into more than anything else could voice loud, sharp command. He turned away from her. You will proceed with the exercise climbing back onto the podium as any if the moment had already treated as insubordination. As if he hadn't just crossed a line. His eyes flicked back to Brooks for just a moment. Formation. A warning. Barked into the microphone. Then he dismissed the formation, commanding. Boots you will proceed with the exercise as soldiers broke ranks any with mechanical precision, but as energy was wrong. Movements were stiff. His eyes flicked back to Brooks for just a moment. Conversations didn't start. A warning. Everyone had dismissed the formation. Everyone would remember. Boots moved in unison. Inside the command broke ranks with Hale slammed his office, but the energy was wrong. The walls were decorated with plaques, commendations, and framed conversations didn't start. Hale shaking hands with everyone had seen it. Hale standing beside everyone would remember. Hale at podiums, inside the command buildings. Hale slammed his office door built on control. The walls were
paced like a
decorated with
caged
plaques,
animal.
commendations, and framed
"How dare
photographs,"
she?"
he muttered.
Hale shaking
ripping off
hands
his
with
gloves
generals,
and tossing them
Hale
onto his
standing
desk.
beside flags,
In front of my
Hale
formation,
at podiums,
Hale
to
at
Hale,
ceremonies.
the slap wasn't a
Proof
loss of
a
control.
career built on control.
It was a correction.
He paced like a
In his
caged
mind,
animal.
Brooks had committed the
"How
ultimate
dare
sin,
she?" he muttered,
public challenge,
ripping off his gloves
rank
and
existed
tossing them
for a
onto his
reason.
desk.
Order
in front of
existed
my
because
formation.
someone enforced it.
To
And
Hale,
Hale
the
had
slap
enforced
wasn't a loss
order
of
his
control.
entire career.
It
by
was a
making
correction.
Sure no one forgot who held
In his
power.
mind, Brooks had committed
Fear
the
was
ultimate
efficient.
sin.
Public challenge.
He poured himself a coffee,
Rank existed
hands
for
steady,
a reason.
breathing even.
Order existed
If anyone
because
asked,
someone
he'd say the
enforced it.
incident was
And Hale had
exaggerated.
enforced
A
order his
disciplinary
entire
gesture,
career,
nothing
by
more.
making sure no one forgot
That was how
who
it
held
always
power.
went.
Fear
Across
was
the
efficient.
base, however, the
He
ripple
poured
had
himself
already
a coffee,
started.
hands steady,
In
breathing
locker
even.
rooms and briefing
If anyone
halls,
asked,
soldiers
he'd say
spoke
the
in
incident
low
was
voices.
exaggerated. A
Did you see
disciplinary
her
gesture,
face?
nothing more.
He hit her.
That was how it
She
always
didn't even
went.
blink.
Across
That was
the base,
messed up.
however, the ripple had
Some
already
said it with
started.
anger, some with
In
disbelief,
locker rooms and briefing
some with
halls,
something dangerously
soldiers
close
spoke
to
in
hope.
low voices. Captain Brooks,
Did you see her
meanwhile,
face?
stood alone in her office,
He hit
staring
her.
at the wall.
She didn't even
She had
blink.
replayed the moment a dozen
That was
times
messed up.
already. Not the
Some
slap,
said it with
but
anger,
the seconds before
some with
it,
disbelief,
the decision
some
to
with
speak,
something
the choice
dangerously
to
close
step
to
forward.
hope.
Captain
She knew the
Brooks,
risk.
meanwhile, stood alone
She
in her
always
office,
had.
staring at the wall. Her cheek throbbed, but
She
she
had
ignored
replayed
it.
the moment a
Pain
dozen
was
times
familiar
already.
What
Not
sat
the
heavier
slap,
was the
but the
knowledge
seconds
that something
before it.
irreversible
The decision
had
to
begun.
speak.
The choice
A
to
knock
step
came at her
forward.
door.
She knew the
Enter.
risk. Lieutenant
She
Harris
always
stepped
had.
in cautiously. Her cheek
He was
throbbed,
young,
but she
capable,
ignored
and
it.
loyal.
Pain was
One of the few
familiar.
officers who
What
didn't
sat heavier
underestimate
was the
her.
knowledge that something
"Ma'am,"
irreversible
he said
had
quietly.
begun. Medical asked if
A
you
knock
want.
came at her door.
No, Brooks
"Enter."
replied, "I'm fine." Lieutenant Harris stepped
Harris
in cautiously.
hesitated.
With
He was
respect,
young,
what he
capable,
did,
and loyal.
is
One of
not
the
your
few
concern,
officers who
she
didn't
cut in
underestimate
gently.
her.
You have an exercise
"Ma'am,"
to
he
prepare
said
for.
quietly.
Medical
Harris
asked if
nodded,
you want,
but he
didn't leave right away.
No, Brooks
Ma'am,
replied,
the
"I'm
soldiers
fine."
saw it.
Harris
I know,
hesitated.
Brooks said. With respect, what
That
he
was
did
what worried her most.
is not your concern.
By evening,
she cut
Hale
in
had
gently.
convinced himself
You have an
the situation
exercise to
was under
prepare
control.
for. Harris
He
nodded,
issued
but
no
he didn't
apology.
leave right away. Requested no
"Ma'am,
report.
the soldiers saw
In
it."
his world, acknowledging
"I know,"
wrongdoing
Brooks
was
said.
weakness, and
That was
weakness
what
invited
worried her
challenge. By
Instead,
evening,
he doubled
Hale
down.
had convinced himself the
During the
situation
next briefing,
was under
he
control.
singled
out Brooks' unit.
He issued no
Scrutinizing
apology,
every minor detail,
requested no
criticizing tone. In his world,
posture,
acknowledging wrongdoing
He made
was
a show of
weakness,
it, death
and
by a
weakness
thousand
invited
cuts.
challenge. Brooks absorbed
Instead,
it all
he doubled
in silence.
down.
That
During the
only
next
fueled
briefing,
him. He singled out
he
Brooks'
wanted
unit,
reaction,
scrutinizing
resistance,
every minor
submission.
detail, criticizing
gave him
tone,
nothing.
posture, timing.
To Hale, that
He
felt
made
like
a show of it,
defiance.
death by a thousand
By
cuts.
nightfall,
he made his
Brooks
decision.
absorbed it all in silence.
The next morning's formation
That
would
only
be larger,
fueled him.
more public. He wanted
He would
reaction,
remind
resistance,
everyone,
especially
submission.
Captain Brooks.
She gave
exactly
him nothing.
who was in charge. To Hale, that felt
At
like
dawn,
defiance. The soldiers assembled
By
again. By nightfall, he made his 500
decision.
uniforms. The next
500
morning's
silent
formation would be
witnesses.
larger, more public.
Brooks
stood in the same
He would
place
remind
as before,
everyone,
her face
especially
calm,
Captain
her cheek
Brooks,
faintly bruised
exactly
beneath
who was in
regulation
charge.
composure.
At
Some
dawn,
soldiers,
the
soldiers
noticed.
assembled.
Others
again. Pretended not to. 500 uniforms.
Hale took the podium.
500 silent witnesses. His tone was sharper today. Brooks
Less
stood in the same
theatrical,
place
more
as
personal.
before, her face calm. We are not
Her
a
cheek
debate
faintly
club,
bruised
beneath regulation.
We are not
composure.
here for opinions.
Some soldiers
we are here for
noticed.
obedience.
Others pretended not
His
to. Gaze locked onto Brooks
Hale
again.
took the podium.
Certain
His
individual
tone
was sharper
he
today.
continued,
Less
seemed
theatrical,
to forget
more
that
personal.
hierarchy exists for a
We are
reason.
not a debate club. A
He
murmur
snapped.
of discomfort.
We are
rippled
not
through
here
the
for
ranks.
opinions.
Not
We are
sound,
here
but
for
energy.
obedience.
Brooks
His felt
gaze
it.
locked
The soldiers
onto Brooks
felt it.
again. Hale
Certain
descended from the
individuals,
podium
he
once
continued,
more. Seemed to
This
forget
time
that
his
hierarchy
steps were
exists
faster.
for a reason. You think I won't
A
make an
murmur of
example,
discomfort
he
rippled
said
through the
quietly
ranks.
as he
Not
approached her
sound,
again.
but energy.
You think one correction
Brooks
gives
felt
you
it.
leverage. The soldiers felt it. Brooks kept her eyes
Hale
forward.
descended
from the podium
Answer
once more.
me.
Hale demanded. This time his steps
Yes,
were
sir.
faster. She said evenly. You think I won't make
The
an
wrong
example?
answer again.
He said quietly as
Hale's
he approached
breathing
her again.
quickened.
His
You think
pride
one
burned.
correction gives you
He
leverage.
leaned in, voice low enough
Brooks
that only
kept
those
her eyes
closest could
forward.
hear.
Answer
You don't
me,
belong
Hale
here,
demanded.
he whispered. People
Yes,
like
sir,
you forget
she
their
said
place.
evenly.
The
That
wrong
word again.
answer again. Place. Hale's
Charles' breathing quickened. The soldiers nearest his pride felt something tight. He leaned in, voice low enough that only those closest could hear. That this was no longer just about rank. You don't belong here. It was about humiliation, people like you about forget their place. Hale raised
word
his
again.
hand.
Place.
And this time he didn't stop. The soldiers nearest them
Brooks
felt
moved.
something tighten in their chests.
Not in anger.
They knew, somehow,
Not in
that
fear.
this was no longer just
In
about
reflex.
rank. It was about
Years of
humiliation,
combat training
about
surged
dominance
to
to the surface.
Hale
Muscle
raised
memory
his hand.
honed under fire,
And this
drilled
time
into
he
her
didn't
bones
stop.
when hesitation meant
Brooks
death.
moved.
Hale's hand
Not in
never
anger.
reached her face.
Not in fear.
She stepped inside his reach,
In reflex.
seized his wrists, and twisted.
Years
of combat training
There was no
surged to the
flourish,
surface, no hesitation. Muscle memory honed under fire,
Just precision.
drilled into her bones.
The sound
when
that
hesitation
followed was
meant death.
unmistakable.
Hale's hand
A
never
collective
reached her
gasp
face.
rippled through the formation.
She
as
stepped
Hale
inside his
screamed,
reach,
seized
collapsed
his wrists
into his
and
knees,
twisted.
his authority
There was
breaking
no
as
flourish,
cleanly as
no
bone.
hesitation.
Brooks released
Just
him
precision.
instantly and stepped back.
The sound that
Hands
followed
at her
was
sides,
unmistakable.
eyes forward. A collective
The formation
gasp rippled
froze.
through the formation as
No
Hale
one
screamed,
breathed.
collapsing
No
to
one
his
spoke.
knees. His authority
base had just
breaking
crossed
as
the point of
cleanly
no
as bone.
return.
Brooks
And every
released him
soldier there
instantly
knew.
and stepped back.
This
Hands
was
at her
only the
sides,
beginning.
eyes
For a
forward.
moment,
no one understood
formation
what they were
froze.
seeing. No
Colonel
one
breathed.
Marcus Hale was on his
No
knees.
one spoke. Not
The
kneeling
base
in
had just
command.
crossed a point of no return.
Not posing for ceremony.
And every soldier there
He was
knew.
collapsed, hunched
This
forward
was
in the
only
dirt.
the beginning.
His face
For a
twisted
moment,
in pain.
no one
so raw
understood
it
what they
stripped
were
him of
seeing.
every ounce of authority
Colonel
he'd
Marcus
ever
Hale
wielded.
was on his knees.
His hands,
those
not
hands
kneeling
that
in
had
command,
signed orders, ended
not
careers,
posing for
struck
ceremony.
a subordinate.
He
were
was
bent at
collapsed,
angles,
hunched
hands
forward
were
in
never
the
meant
dirt.
to bend.
His face twisted in
His
pain
scream tore
so
through
raw
the
it
parade
stripped him
ground.
of
every ounce of authority
It was not
he'd ever
dignified.
wielded. His
It was
hands,
not controlled.
those hands that had signed
It was
orders,
human.
ended careers.
500
soldiers
subordinates
stood frozen
were bent
in
at
formation.
angles, hands
Their
were never
training
meant to
screaming
bend.
at them to stay still.
His scream
while
tore
instinct
through the
begged
parade
them
ground.
to react.
It
Eyes
was not
stared straight
dignified.
ahead, yet every
It was
sense
not
was
controlled.
locked onto the same
It was
impossible
human.
truth.
Power
500
had fallen.
soldiers stood frozen in
Captain
formation.
Alina Brooks stood
their
at
training
attention,
screaming at
her
them
posture
to stay
flawless,
still,
while
her
her
breathing
breathing
begged
measured.
them to react.
Her hands rested
Eyes
calmly
stared
at her
straight
sides.
ahead.
Fingers
Yet every
relaxed,
sense was locked
as if
onto
she
the
had just
same
completed a
impossible
drill
truth.
exactly as instructed.
Power had fallen.
She did not look at
Captain
Hale.
Alina Brooks stood
She
at
did not
attention,
look at the soldiers.
her posture flawless.
She
her
stared
breathing
forward,
measured,
jaw set, eyes
her
steady.
hands rested calmly
The
at her
silence that
sides.
followed
Fingers
was heavier
relaxed,
than the scream,
as if she had just completed
Then
a
someone
drill
shouted,
exactly as instructed.
"Medic!" She did
The
not
spell
look at Hale.
broke.
She
Chaos
did not look
rushed
at the
in all at
soldiers.
once.
She
Two
stared
soldiers
forward,
broke
jaw set,
formation
eyes
without
steady.
being ordered.
The
Sprinting
silence
toward
that
Hale
followed
was
a
heavier
medic
than the
pushed through the
scream.
ranks.
Radio
Then someone
crackling,
shouted,
voice tight with urgency.
"Medic!"
Officers
The spell
looked
broke.
at one another in disbelief.
Chaos rushed in
silently
all at once.
asking the same question.
Two
soldiers broke formation
What do we do
without
now?
being ordered.
Hale
Sprinting
tried to
toward
speak,
Hale,
but it came
a
out
medic
as a
pushed
broken
through the
hiss.
ranks.
His
Radio
face was
crackling,
pale,
voice
sweat pouring
tight with
down his
urgency.
temples despite
Officers
the cold
looked
air.
at one another in disbelief.
She gasped.
silently
She attacked.
asking the same question.
His
words dissolved
What do
into
we do
another
now?
cry of pain.
Hale
as the
tried to
medic
speak,
stabilized
but it
his
came out
wrists.
as a broken hiss.
That was when Brooks'
His face
finally
was
moved.
pale,
sweat pouring
one
down
step
his
back.
temples despite the cold
Perfect
air.
alignment.
He
Still
gasped.
at attention.
She attacked.
Her voice,
His
when it
words
came, was
dissolved
calm.
into another cry of
"Sir,"
pain,
she said,
as the
addressing
medic
no one in
stabilized his
particular.
wrists. Captain Alina Brooks
That was when
reported.
Brooks finally moved.
Colonel Hale initiated
One
physical
step back.
contact. I responded in
alignment.
self-defense.
Still at attention.
The words fell into the open
Her
air
voice, when
like
it
a
came,
live
was
round.
calm.
Several
"Sir," she
soldiers
said,
felt their
addressing
throats
no one in
tighten.
particular.
Others felt
Captain
something
Alina
else
Brooks
entirely.
reporting.
Relief,
Colonel Hale
maybe,
initiated
or
physical
validation.
contact. I
She
responded
hadn't
in
run.
self-defense. She hadn't shouted.
The words fell into the open
She had stated
air like
facts.
a live round.
Military police
Several
arrived
soldiers
within
felt their
minutes.
throats tight.
Their vehicles
Others
cutting
felt
across
something
the
else
parade ground.
entirely.
Red
Relief,
and blue
maybe,
lights flashing
or validation.
against the pale dawn. She
Their
hadn't
presence
run.
shattered any illusion
She hadn't
that this
shouted.
could be handled quietly.
She had stated facts.
An MP sergeant
Military
approached Brooks
police
cautiously,
arrived within minutes.
eyes flicking
Their
between
vehicles
her and
cutting
Hale.
across the parade ground.
"Ma'am," he
Red
said,
and
voice
blue
careful,
lights flashing
"you're going to
against
need
the
to come
pale
with
dawn."
us. Their presence
"Yes, Sergeant,"
shattered
Brooks
any illusion
replied.
that this could be handled
She turned
quietly.
smoothly, offering her
An
wrists
MP
without
sergeant
resistance.
approached Brooks cautiously.
The click of
Eyes
handcuffs
flicking between her
echoed
and
louder
Hale.
than the slap ever had.
"Ma'am," he said, voice
Across
careful,
the formation,
"you're going
jaws
to need
clenched.
to come with us." Hale was lifted
"Yes,
onto
Sergeant,"
a stretcher.
Brooks replied.
His screams now
She
replaced
turned
with
smoothly,
furious,
broken
offering her
commands
wrists no
without
one
resistance.
acknowledged. As he was
The click of
carried away,
handcuffs
his
echoed
eyes
louder
locked
than the
onto
slap
Brooks,
ever had.
burning with rage,
Across the
humiliation,
formation,
and
jaws
something
clenched.
else. Hale was lifted onto a stretcher.
Brooks was escorted
his
through the
screams
base
now
in silence.
replaced with furious,
Soldiers
broken
stopped
commands
what they
no
were
one
doing to
acknowledged.
watch her pass.
As he was
No
carried
one
away,
spoke.
his
No
eyes
one
locked
pointed.
onto Brooks,
A few lowered
burning
their
with
heads,
rage,
not in shame, but
humiliation, and
respect.
something else. Inside the
Fear.
MP holding room,
Brooks was
escorted
seated
through
alone.
the base in silence.
The door closed with a heavy
Soldiers
thud.
stopped what they were doing to
For the
watch
first
her
time
pass.
since the incident,
No one
she
spoke.
exhaled.
No one pointed.
Her hands
A few
trembled
lowered their
slightly,
heads, not in
from
shame,
doubt,
but respect.
but from the adrenaline draining
Inside
out
the
of her
MP
system.
holding room,
She
Brooks
closed her
was seated
eyes
alone,
briefly,
the
grounding
door closed
herself
with
the
a
way
heavy
she had
thud.
learned to do overseas.
For the first time
when
since the
explosions
incident,
faded
she
and
exhaled.
the aftermath set in.
Her hands trembled
She
slightly,
knew what was coming,
not from doubt, but from the
Court-martial was a
adrenaline
possibility.
draining out of her
Discharge,
system.
prison.
She closed her eyes
She
briefly,
also knew something
grounding
else.
herself the way she had
She had
learned
done
to
nothing
do
wrong.
overseas. When explosions
Outside that room,
faded
the base
and the
was
aftermath
buzzing.
set in, rumors spread
She knew
faster
what was
than
coming.
any official report.
Court-martial was a
He hit her
possibility.
again. Discharge, prison.
She broke both his wrists.
She also knew something
She didn't
else.
even hesitate.
She had done nothing
He
wrong.
finally went too far.
Outside that room,
Junior
the base
enlisted
was buzzing.
soldiers whispered in mess
Rumors
halls.
spread faster
Senior
than any official
NCOs
report.
exchanged grim looks
He hit her
behind
again.
closed doors.
She broke both
Officers
his
checked
wrists.
regulations.
She didn't even
replayed the
hesitate
moment in their minds,
and
and
wondered
wondered
how
how
much
much
far
truth would survive the chain
Junior
of command.
enlisted soldiers whispered in
Security
mess halls.
footage was already
Senior
being pulled.
NCOs exchanged
Audio
grim
logs
looks behind
archived.
closed doors.
Statements
Officers
requested.
checked regulations.
This time,
replayed
silence
the
wouldn't
moment
be
in their
enough.
minds and wondered how
afternoon,
much truth
the
would
first
survive the
investigator
chain of
arrived.
command.
Lieutenant
Security
Colonel
footage
Avery
was already
Judge
being
Advocate
pulled.
General. Audio logs
She reviewed
archived.
the footage alone.
Statements requested.
She watched Hale step forward.
This time, silence
watched
wouldn't
him
be
raise
enough.
his hand.
By afternoon,
Watch Brooks
the
move.
first investigator
Controlled, minimal,
arrived.
defensive.
Lieutenant Colonel
Avery
Avery
paused the video.
Judge
and
Advocate
leaned back
General.
in her chair. She reviewed
This
the footage
isn't
alone.
insubordination, she murmured.
She watched Hale
This
step
is
forward.
restraint.
Watched
She
him raise
requested
his
Brooks'
hand.
full service record.
Watch Brooks move.
What she
Controlled,
found made her
minimal,
sit up
defensive.
straighter.
Avery
Combat
paused the
citations
video and leaned
leadership
back in her chair.
commendations.
This
Psychological
isn't
evaluation,
insubordination,
nodding,
she murmured.
exceptional
This
impulse
is
control
restraint.
under extreme stress.
She requested Brooks'
full
no
service
history of
record.
violence, no
What she found
disciplinary
made her
actions.
sit up straighter.
If Brooks had wanted
Combat
to hurt Hale,
citations
she could have.
leadership commendations.
She hadn't.
Psychological
That
evaluations.
evening, Brooks
nodding,
was released from
exceptional
holding,
impulse
not
control
free,
under
but
extreme
no longer
stress.
restrained.
No
She
history
returned
of
to her
violence.
quarters under
no
escort.
disciplinary
The
actions.
base felt different now.
If Brooks
Heavier,
had wanted to
charged.
hurt Hale, she could have.
As she closed her door,
She hadn't.
She finally allowed herself
That evening,
to touch
Brooks
her cheek.
was released from holding.
The bruise
Not
was
free,
darker than
but
she
no
expected.
longer restrained. She stared at her
She
reflection
returned to
in
her
the mirror,
quarters under escort.
meeting her own
The
eyes.
base felt different now.
Worth
heavier,
it, she said
charged.
quietly. As she
Across
closed
town,
her door,
in a private
she
military
finally allowed
hospital
herself
room,
to touch her
Hale
cheek.
stared at the ceiling.
The bruise was darker
Both
than she
arms were
expected.
immobilized.
She stared at her
Painkillers
reflection
filled the
in the
agony,
mirror,
but not the
meeting her
humiliation.
own eyes.
His phone buzzed
Worth it,
nonstop.
she said quietly.
Missed calls, unanswered
Across
messages.
town, in a private military
For the first
hospital
time in
room,
decades,
Hale
no
stared
one
at the
was
ceiling.
rushing to defend him.
Both arms
He
were
remembered the look
immobilized.
on Brooks' face.
Painkillers dulled the agony,
Not
but
anger,
not the humiliation.
not hatred.
His phone buzzed nonstop.
Control,
missed calls,
that terrified
unanswered
him.
messages. The following
For the
morning,
first time in
an
decades,
official announcement
no one was
echoed across
rushing to
Fort
defend
Harrington.
him.
He
Colonel
remembered
Marcus
the look
Hale
on Brooks'
was
face,
relieved of
operational
anger,
command pending
not
investigation.
hatred. Control.
500 soldiers heard
That
it.
terrified him,
And every single
The
one
following
of them
morning,
knew exactly
an
why.
official announcement
Fort
echoed
Harrington
across
had never
Fort
been
Harrington.
quiet, but now
Colonel
it was
Marcus
watchful.
Hale was relieved
The morning
of
after Colonel
operational
Hale was
command
relieved
pending
of command,
investigation.
the base felt like it was
500
holding its breath.
soldiers heard it.
Conversations stopped
And every
when
single
officers
one of
entered
them knew
rooms.
exactly why.
Phones were checked.
Fort
and
Harrington
rechecked.
had never been
Doors
quiet,
that were once
but
open
now
now
it was
stayed
watchful.
closed. The morning
Everyone
after
knew
Colonel
something
Hale was
unprecedented
relieved of
was
command,
unfolding.
the base felt like it was
Captain
holding its
Alina
breath.
Brooks sat alone
Conversations
in a small
stopped when
conference room
officers
inside
entered
the
rooms.
administrative wing.
Phones were checked,
Hands
and
folded
rechecked.
neatly on the
Doors
table.
that were once
A
open
recorder
now stayed
sat
between
closed.
her and the empty chair.
Everyone knew
across from
something
her.
unprecedented
Its red light
was
blinking
unfolding.
patiently. Captain
She had
Alina
been
Brooks
waiting
sat
for nearly
alone in a
40
small
minutes.
conference room inside
Brooks
the
didn't mind
administrative
waiting.
wing. She had
Hands
waited in
folded
worse
neatly
places
on the table.
half-collapsed
A
buildings,
recorder sat
dark
between
alleys
her and
overseas,
the empty chair
listening
across
to
from
radios
her.
crackle
Its
while
red light
decisions were
blinking
made far
patiently.
above her.
She
Waiting
had been
was
waiting
familiar.
for nearly 40 minutes.
What mattered was what
Brooks
came
didn't
after.
mind waiting.
The
She
door
had waited
finally
in
opened.
worse places.
Lieutenant
Half-collapsed
Colonel
buildings,
Avery
dark
entered,
alleys overseas,
followed by a civilian
civilian analyst and a senior NCO acting far above her, Avery's
Waiting was
expression was
familiar.
professional but unreadable.
What mattered was what
she
came
sat,
after.
pressed a button on the
door
recorder
finally
and met
opened.
Brooks' eyes.
Lieutenant Colonel
For the
Avery
record,
entered,
Avery
followed
said,
by a civilian
"This is a
analyst
preliminary
and a senior
inquiry under
NCO
Article
acting as
128 and related
Avery's
conduct
expression was
violations.
professional but
Captain
unreadable.
Brooks,
Do
she
you
sat,
understand why you're
pressed
here?
a button on the recorder and met
Yes,
Brooks'
ma'am, Brooks
eyes.
replied evenly.
For the record,
Avery
nodded.
said,
"Start
this
from
is
the
a
beginning."
preliminary inquiry
Brooks
under
did.
Article 128
She described
and
the
related
training
conduct
plan,
violations,
the tactical concern,
Captain
her
Brooks,
decision to speak
do you
up,
understand why
Hale's
you're here?
words, the slap,
Yes,
the
ma'am,
second approach.
Brooks replied
The
evenly.
moment his hand rose again,
Avery nodded.
"Start
She did
from
not
the beginning."
embellish. Brooks
She did not
did.
justify.
She described
She
the
simply
training
described
plan,
facts.
the tactical concern.
When she
her
finished,
decision to speak
Avery
up,
sat back
Hale's
and studied
words,
her carefully.
The slap, the second
"Captain,"
approach.
Avery asked,
the moment his hand
"why didn't you
rose
report
again,
the initial strike
She
immediately?"
did not embellish. Brooks didn't
She
hesitate.
did not justify.
Because I believe
She
the
simply
exercise
described
and the
facts.
soldiers' safety
When she
were
finished,
still the priority.
Avery sat back and
because
studied her carefully.
reporting Colonel Hale has
"Captain,"
historically
Avery
resulted
asked,
in consequences.
"why didn't you report
the initial strike
Avery's
immediately?"
eyebrow twitched slightly.
Brooks didn't hesitate.
"Consequences?"
Because
she
I
repeated.
believe the exercise
"Yes,
and the
ma'am."
soldiers' safety
The
were
civilian
still the
analyst
priority.
scribbled notes
and
faster.
because reporting Colonel
Avery
Hale
leaned
has
forward.
historically
"Do you
resulted
regret
in
your
consequences?"
response?
Brooks met her
Avery's
gaze.
eyebrow twitched slightly.
"No, ma'am.
"Consequences?"
Silence
she
settled
repeated.
between them.
"Yes, ma'am."
Then Avery nodded
The civilian
once
analyst
and turned off the
scribbled notes
recorder.
faster.
Elsewhere
Avery
on base,
leaned forward.
pressure was mounting.
"Do you regret your response?"
Senior officers
Brooks
convened
met her
behind
gaze.
closed doors,
"No,
voices
ma'am."
low but urgent.
Silence
Hale
settled
had
between
connections, powerful ones.
Then Avery
years
nodded
of favors,
once
and turned off the
careers
recorder.
built with his endorsement.
Elsewhere on base,
This wasn't
pressure
just
was
about
mounting.
one incident.
Senior officers
This was about
convened
precedent.
behind closed doors.
"If we let
voices
this stand,"
low but
one
urgent,
colonel argued,
Hale had connections,
opened the door to
powerful
chaos.
ones. Years of favors.
"If we bury it,"
careers
another
built
countered
with his
quietly,
endorsement.
"we become complicit."
This wasn't just about
That
one
word
incident.
hung in the air.
This was
Complicit.
about precedent. Outside
"If
those
we
rooms,
let this stand,"
soldiers were
one
talking.
colonel argued,
Not
"we open
loudly,
the door to
not
chaos."
recklessly. If
But
we
honestly,
bury it, another countered
stories
quietly,
surfaced,
we
old
become
ones.
complicit. Times Hale had gone
That
too
word
far.
hung in the air.
Promotions denied
Complicit.
without explanation. Outside
Careers
those rooms,
stalled after
soldiers
private
were talking.
conversations.
Not
Written
loudly,
complaints
not
that
recklessly,
disappeared
into
But
administrative
honestly,
black holes. Stories
and
surfaced,
always the
old
same
ones.
ending.
Times Hale had
Nothing
gone
happened.
too far. Promotions
Until
denied
now.
without explanation.
In the military hospital,
careers stalled
Colonel
after
Hale
private
watched the news
conversations.
cycle unfold
Written
from his
complaints
bed.
that disappeared into
Both wrists were
administrative
casted.
black holes. His pain was constant,
always
but it
the same
paled next
ending.
to the rage boiling
Nothing
beneath it.
happened.
His phone lay
Until
on the
now.
bedside table in the
Screen
military
dark.
hospital.
No
Colonel
calls
Hale
from
watched
command.
the news cycle unfold
No
from his
reassurances.
bed. Just
Both
one
wrists were
official
casted.
message. His pain was
You are not to
constant, but it
contact
paled
base
next to the
personnel
rage
pending
boiling beneath
investigation.
it. His phone lay
Hale
on the
clenched his
bedside
jaw.
table, screen dark.
They were abandoning him.
No calls from command.
He replayed the moment again.
No
and again.
reassurances. Not the pain, but
Just
the look
one
on
official
Brooks'
message.
face.
She
You are
hadn't
not to
panicked.
contact base
She
personnel
hadn't
pending
hesitated.
investigation.
She had been ready.
Hale clenched his jaw. That realization
They were
gnawed at him.
abandoning him.
By day 3,
replayed the
the
moment
investigation
again and again.
expanded. Not the pain, but
What
the look
began
on
as
Brooks'
an inquiry
face. Into a single
She
altercation
hadn't panicked.
widened into a full
She
command
hadn't hesitated.
climate review.
She had been
Inspectors
ready.
arrived. External
That realization
oversight
was
was
requested.
requested. Files
By
long
day 3,
untouched
the
were
investigation
expanded. And then someone found
What
it.
began as an inquiry
A complaint
into a
from
single
6 years
altercation
earlier widened into a full
Another captain,
command
different
climate
base,
review.
same pattern.
Inspectors arrived. Dismissed
External
due to lack of
oversight was
corroboration.
requested.
Files
This time
long
there was
untouched were
corroboration.
reopened. 500
then someone
witnesses.
found it.
A
Security
complaint from
footage.
6 years earlier.
Audio logs.
Another captain, different
A system
base,
that
same
suddenly
pattern.
couldn't
Look away. Dismissed due
Brooks
to lack
continued
of corroboration
reporting
for
for
duty. Restricted.
This time there was
supervised but
corroboration.
present. 500
trained her
witnesses
unit
as usual.
Security
Issued clear
footage.
instructions. Corrected
Audio
mistakes
logs.
quietly. A system that
The
suddenly
soldiers
couldn't
noticed.
look away. One morning,
Brooks
as she
continued
walked
reporting
across the
for
training
duty.
yard, restricted,
A private snapped to
supervised
attention
but
present.
slightly faster than
She
required.
trained her unit as
Another
usual.
nodded subtly. Issued clear
An
instructions.
NCO met her
corrected
eyes and held the
mistakes
gaze.
quietly. None
The
of it
soldiers
was
noticed.
insubordinate. One morning,
All of it
as
was
she walked
deliberate.
across the training yard,
Respect,
a private
once
snap
withheld,
to
had
attention
found its
slightly
way back.
faster than required.
Avery called
Another
Brooks in
nodded
again.
subtly.
Late that
An
afternoon.
NCO met her eyes.
This
and
time
held
the
the tone
gaze.
was different. None of it was
Captain,
insubordinate.
Avery said,
sliding a
all
folder
of it
across
was
the
deliberate.
table.
I want you to read
Respect,
this.
once withheld,
Brooks
had found its
opened
way
it.
back.
Inside
Avery
were copies
called
of
Brooks
prior
again,
reports,
late that
statements,
afternoon.
evaluations.
This time the tone
She
was
read
different.
silently, her expression
Captain,
unchanged.
Avery said, sliding a
These
folder
were never
across the
supposed to
table.
disappear.
I want you
Avery
to read
continued.
this. They did.
Brooks opened
Someone
it.
made sure of it.
Inside were
Brooks
copies of
closed
prior
the
reports,
folder.
statements,
Ma'am,
evaluations.
she said carefully, with respect.
She read silently,
This isn't about me
her expression
anymore.
unchanged.
Avery smiled
These
faintly.
were never supposed to disappear.
No, she said,
Avery
it
continued.
They
That
did.
night,
Someone
Fort
made
Harrington
sure of it.
received another announcement.
Brooks closed the folder.
Short official.
Ma'am, she said
Colonel
carefully,
Marcus Hale
with
is
respect,
formally
this
under
isn't about me
investigation for
anymore.
conduct unbecoming.
Avery smiled
Abuse
faintly.
of authority and assault.
No, she said, it is.
The message spread faster
night,
than
Fort
anything
Harrington
before. Received another announcement.
In barracks and offices,
Short
soldiers
official.
sat quietly,
Colonel
absorbing
Marcus
what it
Hale
meant.
is formally under
The system
investigation
was
for
no
conduct
longer
unbecoming
protecting him.
Abuse of
And
authority
systems
and assault
rarely turned back once they
the
started
message
moving.
spread faster than anything
Brooks
before.
lay awake in her quarters,
In barracks
staring
and
at the
offices,
ceiling.
soldiers sat
She
quietly,
felt no triumph,
absorbing what it meant.
Only wait. The system was
She knew
no
the cost
longer
of what she'd
protecting
started.
him. Reputations
And systems
would fall.
rarely turned
Lines
back
would
once
be
they
drawn.
started moving.
Some people would resent her
Brooks
forever.
lay awake in her quarters,
But she also
staring
knew
at the
this.
ceiling.
Silence
She
had
felt
already
no
cost
triumph.
too much. Only wait.
Outside, the base lights
She knew
glowed
the cost
against
of
the dark
what she'd
desert
started.
sky.
Reputations
Steady and
would fall.
unforgiving.
Lines would
For
be
the first
drawn.
time since
Some
arriving
people
at
would
Fort
resent
Harrington,
her forever.
Brooks allowed herself
But
a
she also
small,
knew this.
controlled breath.
Silence had already
Whatever
cost
came
too
next.
much. She was
Outside,
ready.
the base
The
lights
base had
glowed
changed
against the
overnight.
dark desert sky.
Not in
Steady
appearance
and unforgiving.
not in drills.
For the
not
first
in the
time
hours
since
of work
arriving
or the
at Fort
sound of
Harrington,
boots on gravel.
Brooks allowed herself a small,
It had changed in
controlled
spirit.
breath.
Whatever
500
came
soldiers
next,
now moved with a
she
new
was ready.
awareness.
The base
That
had changed
authority was
overnight.
not absolute.
Not in
That
appearance,
courage could exist
not in
quietly,
drills,
but when it
not
did,
in the hours
it
of
had
work or the
consequences.
sound of boots on gravel.
Captain Alina Brooks
It had
walked
changed
the
in
parade
spirit.
ground that morning with her usual
500
precision.
soldiers now moved.
She moved
with a
like
new
every
awareness.
step was measured.
That authority
Every
was not
eye was
absolute.
watching.
That
But this
courage
time,
could
it
exist
didn't matter.
quietly.
But
She
when
didn't
it
flinch.
did, it had
She
consequences.
didn't adjust her posture to placate
Captain
anyone.
Alina Brooks walked the parade
soldiers
ground that
noticed.
morning with her usual
A
precision.
private in the second
She
row
moved
straightened
like
without
every
being
step was
told.
measured.
A
Every
corporal
eye
in the
was
back
watching.
of the formation
But this
nodded,
time,
just
it
slightly,
didn't matter.
acknowledging
She
her
didn't
presence.
flinch.
Others
She didn't
followed
adjust her
suit in
posture
their
to
own
placate
small,
anyone.
subtle ways.
The
None
soldiers
of it was
noticed.
disobedience.
A
All
private
of it
in the
was
second row
recognition.
straightened without being
Hale
told.
was not present
A
that
corporal
morning.
in the back of the
He
formation
remained confined
nodded,
to the
just
hospital
slightly,
wing,
acknowledging
still
her presence.
recovering, still
Others
furious,
followed suit,
still
in their own
convinced
small,
that what had
subtle
happened
ways.
was a mistake.
None
that
of
could
it
be
was
corrected with
disobedience.
intimidation.
All
and
of it was
connections.
recognition.
But the ripple he
Hale
had
was not
unleashed
present
was
that morning.
unstoppable.
He remained confined
Inside
to the hospital
temporary
wing,
investigation
still
office,
recovering.
Lieutenant
still
Colonel
furious,
Avery was
still
collecting
convinced
statements.
that what had happened
Soldiers
was a mistake
came one
that could
after
be corrected
another,
with
some
intimidation
nervous,
and connections.
some defiant, all truthful.
But the ripple he had unleashed
I saw
was
it happen,
unstoppable.
said Specialist Torres,
Inside
young
the
voice
temporary
shaking but firm.
investigation office,
Captain Brooks
Lieutenant
didn't strike
Colonel
first.
Avery was
He
collecting
raised his
statements.
hands. She
Soldiers
defended herself.
came one after
Fast,
another,
clean,
some nervous,
precise.
some defiant.
Another
all
Sergeant
truthful.
Hall, older and
I
grizzled,
saw it happen,
leaned back
said
in his
Specialist
chair.
Torres, young
I've seen
voice shaking
officers
but
get
firm.
slapped around before.
Captain Brooks didn't
I've
strike
seen people
first.
panic.
He raised
She
his
didn't.
hand.
She
Defended
acted.
herself.
And it was
Fast,
over before
clean,
I could
precise.
even blink.
That's the first
Another
time
Sergeant
I've seen
Hall,
someone
older
respond
and
like that
grizzled,
to him
leaned
and
back
not get
in his
punished.
chair.
I've seen
Avery
officers
made
get
notes.
slapped around
Every
before.
word mattered.
I've seen
Every
people
witness
panic.
built the
She
story
didn't.
that Hale could
She
no
just
longer
acted.
control.
And it was over before
By mid-afternoon,
I could even blink.
the investigators
That's the
had
first
enough
time I've seen
corroboration
someone
to make a
respond like
preliminary
that to him and
determination.
not get punished.
The act was self-defense.
Avery made notes.
But military
Every word
bureaucracy
mattered.
moved slowly.
Every witness
and
built the
Hale's
story
network
that
of Hale
influence
could no
was deep.
longer control.
Papers had to be filed.
By mid-afternoon,
evidence had
the
to be
investigators
cross-checked,
had
and
enough
command
corroboration
channels
to
had
make
to
a
be
preliminary
respected.
determination.
Brooks
The
knew
act
this.
was self-defense.
She also knew that
but
every
military
delay was
bureaucracy
another
moved
opportunity
slowly,
for pushback.
and Hale's
for
network
Hale's
of influence
allies
was
to bury
deep.
the truth.
Papers
to
had to
silence
be
those
filed.
willing to speak.
Evidence had to be cross-checked.
Meanwhile,
and
Hale
command
was packing
channels
his
had to be
hospital
respected.
room. Brooks knew
Painkillers
this.
dulled his wrist.
She also
but they
knew
did
that
nothing
every
for his
delay
rage.
was another opportunity
This
for
is
pushback.
temporary,
For
he muttered,
Hale's
gripping
allies
the
to
sheets
bury
until
the
his
truth,
knuckles whitened.
to silence those
She got
willing
lucky,
to speak.
that's all.
Meanwhile, A nurse
Hale was
entered,
packing his
asking if he
hospital
wanted
room.
ice packs adjusted.
Painkillers
He waved
dulled his
her
wrists.
off. His
But they
thoughts
did nothing
were
for his
elsewhere,
rage.
plans, letters,
This is
phone
temporary,
calls, influence.
he muttered,
He
gripping
had been
the
a
sheets
master
until
of
his
control
knuckles
for
whitened.
decades.
She got
and
lucky,
now none of
that's
it
all.
mattered. A nurse
called a
entered,
trusted
asking
former
if he wanted
subordinate
ice
who
packs
owed him
adjusted.
favors.
He waved
Do
her
everything
off.
you can,
His thoughts
he
were
instructed.
elsewhere. Plans,
Do you understand?
letters, phone
I need
calls,
this
influence.
influence.
He had been a
The
master of
subordinate
control for
hesitated.
decades.
Sir, the
and now
soldiers.
none of it mattered. They will obey.
He
Hale
called a
snapped.
trusted
Do
former
it.
subordinate who owed him
Even
favors.
as he spoke, somewhere
Do everything
in the base,
you can,
soldiers were
he
quietly
instructed.
preparing to
Do
tell
you understand?
the truth.
I need
One
this
report,
contained.
one witness,
The
one
subordinate
fact
hesitated.
at a time. Sir, the soldiers.
The power balance had shifted.
They will obey. Hale
That
snapped.
evening,
Do
Brooks
it.
returned to her quarters
Even
after
as
a
he
long
spoke,
day of
somewhere in the
statements,
base, soldiers were
recordings, and
quietly
supervision.
preparing to tell the truth.
Her unit had been
one
drilled,
report,
orders
one
given,
witness,
mistakes
one fact
corrected,
at a time, discipline maintained.
The power balance
all
had
under the
shifted.
watchful eye of
That
internal
evening,
investigators.
Brooks returned to her quarters
Yet
after
something
a long
was
day of
different.
statements,
Where
recordings,
there had
and
been
supervision.
fear, now there was
Her
curiosity.
unit had been drilled,
Where there had been silence,
orders given,
now there were whispers
mistakes
of
corrected,
admiration. Discipline maintained.
A young lieutenant
all
approached
under
her
the
quietly.
watchful eye of internal
Ma'am, if you need
investigators.
anything, we've got your back.
Yet something was different.
Brooks nodded once, barely
Where there had been
perceptible.
fear,
I
now
know.
there was curiosity.
It was enough.
Where there had been silence,
The next
now
day,
there were whispers
a hearing
of
was
admiration.
scheduled
for Colonel Hale.
A young lieutenant
Briefing
approached
only,
her quietly.
preliminary.
Ma'am,
meant to
if you
gauge
need
what
anything,
the formal
we've got your back.
investigation would conclude.
Brooks nodded once,
Brooks
barely
was required
perceptible.
to attend.
I know.
She arrived early,
It was enough.
dressed sharply,
The
standing
next day,
apart from the rest
a hearing
of the
was
assembly.
scheduled for Colonel
She
Hale.
remained calm,
Briefing
composed,
only,
neutral,
preliminary,
letting others talk,
meant to gauge
letting
what the
others
formal
fidget.
investigation would
Hale
conclude.
was wheeled in on a stretcher.
Brooks was
cast
required
stark
to
against
attend.
his uniform.
She arrived
face
early,
pale and
dressed
drawn
sharply,
with anger,
standing apart
but he
from the
carried
rest of the
himself like a
assembly.
man who still
She remained
believed power
calm,
could
composed,
override
neutral,
truth.
letting others talk.
You know
letting
why you're
others
here,
fidget,
said the presiding
Hale
officer.
was wheeled in on a
Captain
stretcher.
Brooks,
Actions
cast stark
have been
against his
questioned,
uniform,
and we need
face
to
pale
understand the
and drawn
circumstances.
with anger.
But he
Hale
carried
opened
himself
his
like
mouth,
a man who still
ready to
believed
spin,
power could
ready to
override
accuse,
truth,
ready to dominate
You
the
know
room
why
like
you're
he had
here,
dominated
said
the
the
base
presiding
for
officer.
decades.
Captain
But
Brooks,
then the testimonies
actions have
began.
been questioned, and we need
First,
to
the
understand
medics.
the circumstances.
Second, the soldiers who had witnessed
Hale
it
opened his
firsthand.
mouth.
Third,
ready to
the
spin,
internal
ready
recordings.
to accuse,
ready
Each
to
statement
dominate the
layered
room
another
like he had
truth
dominated
over
the base
Hale's
for
authority.
decades.
Each fact chipped
But
away
then the
at his
testimonies
narrative.
began.
Each corroboration
First,
made
the
the room
medics.
less pliable.
Second, the soldiers who had
Hale's
witnessed it
face turned
firsthand.
red. He tried
Third,
to interrupt.
the internal
The presiding
recordings.
officer raised a hand.
Each statement
Silence.
layered another truth over
Brooks
Hale's
sat
authority.
listening, not
Each
gloating,
fact
not
chipped
anxious,
away at his
just
narrative.
listening. Each
Because
corroboration
she knew the
made
system
room
didn't
less
punish
pliable.
facts,
Only fear.
Hale's face
and now
turned red.
fear was
He
gone.
tried to interrupt.
The
By the
presiding
end of the
officer
hearing,
raised a
something
hand.
unprecedented had
Silence.
happened.
Brooks sat
The presiding
listening,
officer
not gloating,
concluded.
not anxious.
The captain's
just listening.
actions were justified
because she knew
the
the
assault
system
on
didn't punish
Colonel
facts.
Hale was
Only
defensive,
fear,
not
and
aggressive.
now fear was gone.
Her conduct reflected
By the
discipline
end of the
and
hearing,
professionalism.
something unprecedented
It
had
was the
happened.
first public acknowledgement
The presiding
that Hale
officer
had lost
concluded
control.
The captain's
That his
actions
power,
were justified.
built on intimidation
The assault
and
on
unchecked
Colonel
authority,
Hale was defensive,
no longer
not
untouchable.
aggressive. Her conduct
In the crowd,
reflected
soldiers
discipline
murmured,
and
heads
professionalism.
lifted slightly.
It was
bright.
the first public acknowledgement
Some
that
nodded,
Hale had lost
others
control.
whispered quietly
That his
Some,
power,
older
built
and
on
cynical,
intimidation
shook their
and
heads in
unchecked
disbelief,
authority,
but
was
even
no
they
longer
understood the
untouchable.
significance.
In the
Brooks
crowd,
did not
soldiers
react
murmured,
outwardly.
heads lifted
Inside,
slightly.
she allowed
eyes
herself
bright.
a brief, private sense
Some
of
nodded.
satisfaction.
Others whispered
Justice
quietly.
wasn't loud.
Some,
Justice
older
was
and cynical,
precise,
shook their
measured,
heads
and
in
disbelief.
undeniable. But even they
That
understood
night,
the
as the base
significance.
quieted, the ripple
Brooks
continued.
did not react outwardly.
Soldiers spoke in
Inside,
hushed
she allowed
tones
herself
in
a
barracks
brief,
and mess
private
halls.
sense of satisfaction.
The story of the slap,
Justice
the
wasn't
retaliation,
loud.
the unwavering
Justice
calm
was
of
precise,
Captain Brooks,
measured,
it spread,
and undeniable.
not as gossip,
That
not
night,
as
as the
rumor,
base quieted,
as truth.
the ripple continued,
And with truth came reflection.
soldiers spoke in hushed
Senior
tones
NCOs
in barracks and
spoke
mess
with
halls.
juniors,
The
carefully
story of the
guiding
slap, the
conversation.
retaliation, the
Courage
unwavering
isn't
calm
always
of
loud,
Captain Brooks,
one
it
said.
spread.
Not
Sometimes
as gossip,
it's standing
not
firm
as
when
rumor,
everyone
as
expects you to
truth.
break. And with truth,
The younger
came
soldiers
reflection.
listened, eyes
Senior
wide.
NCOs
Something
spoke with
fundamental
juniors,
shifted in their
carefully
perception
guiding
of
the
authority,
conversation.
respect,
Courage
and
isn't always loud.
Meanwhile,
One said. Hale's influence
Sometimes
dwindled.
it's standing firm
Calls
when
went
everyone
unanswered.
expects you to break.
Meetings were postponed.
The younger soldiers
Allies
listened,
whispered that
eyes
the tide
wide.
had turned.
Something
His name,
fundamental
once
shifted
synonymous
in their
with
perception
power,
of authority,
now carried
respect,
whispers of
and
shame.
courage.
Brooks did
Meanwhile,
not celebrate.
Hale's influence
She could
dwindled.
not. The fight
Calls calls went unanswered, but she had made a statement. Postponed. One individual allies whispered that the tide had turned, could challenge his name once synonymous with and power, still uphold the values of the military. Brooks did not celebrate her journal. She could not. A habit from the fight was not over. But she had made
2
a
seconds
statement.
changed everything.
One individual, disciplined
Not because
and
I wanted it
skilled,
to,
could challenge abuse
because
without
someone
fear,
had to,
and still
the base was
uphold
no
the
longer the
values of
same
the military.
place it had been.
That night,
Fort
she
Harrington
wrote in her
thrummed
journal with a
a
strange
habit
energy.
from deployments long
The
ago.
sun rose over the desert
2 seconds
in pale
changed
streaks,
everything.
casting long shadows
Not because
over the
I
training
wanted it
yard.
to,
Soldiers
because someone
moved
had
with
to.
purpose, but
The
there was a
base was no
subtle
longer the
change in
same
the air,
place it had
a
been.
quiet awareness,
Fort
a
Harrington
shifting of
thrummed with a
lines that no
strange
one could
energy.
ignore. The sun rose
Colonel
over the
Marcus
desert in
Hale had
pale
been
streaks,
hospitalized,
casting long
his wrists
shadows over the
immobilized
training
in
yard.
thick casts.
Soldiers moved with
Painkillers
purpose,
dulled the
but there was
physical
a subtle
agony.
change
But
in the air,
humiliation
a
remained
quiet
sharp,
awareness,
piercing,
a shifting of
unrelenting.
lines that no
For the
one
first
could
time in
ignore.
decades, he felt powerless.
Colonel Marcus Hale had been hospitalized.
Hale's world had always
His
been
wrists
orderly.
immobilized
Authority
in
was
thick
law.
casts. Fear was currency.
Painkillers dulled the
Reputation
physical
a shield.
agony.
But
And
now
humiliation
all of it was
remained
gone.
sharp, piercing,
Inside
unrelenting.
the temporary
For the
investigation
first time
office,
in decades,
Lieutenant
he felt
Colonel
powerless.
Avery reviewed the evidence
Hale's
for the
world
third
had
time
always
that
been
day.
orderly.
The footage
Authority
of the
was law.
confrontation,
Fear
captured
was
from
currency.
multiple angles,
Reputation a
had been
shield.
studied down
And
to
now
the smallest
all of it was
detail.
gone.
Audio logs
Inside the
confirmed
temporary
every statement
investigation
from Brooks.
office,
Witness
Lieutenant
statements
Colonel
from
Avery
soldiers,
reviewed the evidence for the
NCOs,
third time
privates,
that day.
and lieutenants alike.
The footage of the
lined up
confrontation,
perfectly, captured from multiple
but it wasn't
angles,
enough.
had
Not
been studied
yet.
down to the smallest
The military
detail.
system was
Audio
complex,
logs
hierarchical,
confirmed every
stubborn.
statement from Brooks.
Even overwhelming
Witness
evidence
statements from
required
soldiers,
procedural steps,
NCOs,
corroboration,
privates, and lieutenants
documentation,
alike, lined up
interviews,
perfectly.
formal submissions. But it wasn't
Each
enough.
step allowed
Not yet.
room for influence.
The
for
military
delay,
system
for
was
Hale's
complex,
allies to exert
hierarchical,
pressure.
stubborn.
Even
Avery
overwhelming
sighed.
evidence
She had to
required
anticipate
procedural
every
steps,
possible move,
corroboration,
and she had to be
documentation,
meticulous.
interviews,
There could be no
formal
mistakes,
submissions.
not this time.
Each step allowed
Meanwhile,
room for
Brooks
influence,
moved
for
through her
delay,
unit with
for
quiet
Hale's
purpose.
allies to
The
exert
soldiers
pressure.
under her command were tense
Avery
but
sighed.
attentive.
She had to
Each
anticipate
drill,
every
each
possible
instruction,
move.
every
And she had to be
correction
meticulous.
reinforced discipline.
There could be no mistakes,
but it carried a
not
subtle,
this time.
invisible lesson.
Meanwhile,
Integrity
Brooks
and
moved through
skill
her unit
mattered
with quiet
more than
purpose.
intimidation.
The soldiers under her
A private
command
whispered
were
to
tense
another
but
during a
attentive.
break in formation.
Each drill,
Did you
each
see her
instruction,
face?
every
Calm the whole
correction
time,
reinforced
not even
discipline.
flinched.
But it carried a
Yeah,
subtle,
the other
invisible
replied.
lesson.
And he's broken.
Integrity
Both
and
wrists
skill mattered
Can you believe
more than
that?
intimidation.
A sergeant
A private
overheard
whispered
but said
to another
nothing.
during a break
A smile
in formation.
flickered briefly
Did you see
across
her
his
face?
Calm
Almost
the whole
imperceptible,
time.
not even
Respect
flinched.
was growing in ways
Yeah,
Hale
the
could
other
never
replied.
have bought.
And
Bullied
he's
or
broken
coerced.
both wrists. Can you
Hale's
believe
hospital
that?
room was a
A
different
sergeant
world.
overheard but said
He
nothing.
stared at the ceiling,
A smile
waiting,
flickered briefly
scheming,
across
calculating.
his face. Almost
Calls to
imperceptible.
former allies went
Respect was
unanswered.
growing in ways
Officers
Hale
who
could
once
never
deferred
have
to
bought,
his authority
bullied,
now
or coerced.
avoided eye contact.
Hale's hospital
network
room
was
the
a different
invisible
world.
web that had always
He
protected
stared at
him,
the
had
ceiling,
frayed.
waiting, scheming,
I won't
calculating.
be undone, he muttered
Calls
to himself,
to former
hands
allies
curled
went
around the
unanswered.
bedsheet.
I have
Officers who
control.
once deferred
I
to
always
his
have
authority
control.
now avoided eye
But
contact.
control is an illusion.
His network,
And in
the
Hale's
invisible
case,
web that
it was
had
slipping
always
through his
protected
fingers
him,
faster
frayed.
than he could comprehend.
I won't be undone.
The
he muttered to
investigation
himself,
intensified.
hands curled around the bedsheet.
Auditors,
I have
legal
control,
teams, and
I
internal
always have
investigators
control.
combed through records.
But control is
Files
an
from
illusion.
previous
And in
bases
Hale's
were
case,
retrieved.
it was slipping
revealing
through
a
his fingers
history of
faster than he
misconduct
could
previously
comprehend.
buried.
The
Complaints about
investigation
intimidation,
intensified.
unfair disciplinary
Auditors,
actions,
legal
and
teams,
unreported
and internal
harassment.
investigators combed through
One
records.
report, nearly
Files
6 years
from
old,
previous bases
described
were
a junior
retrieved,
officer's
revealing
complaint
a
about
history of
Hale's
misconduct
public
previously
humiliation
buried.
tactics.
The
Complaints
complaint
about
had
intimidation,
disappeared into the
unfair
bureaucratic
disciplinary
void,
actions,
dismissed
and
for
unreported
lack of harassment.
corroboration. One
Now it
report,
mattered.
nearly 6 years
Avery
old,
reviewed the
described
report
a junior
carefully.
officer's
Each
complaint
line
about
highlighted
Hale's
a pattern,
public humiliation
a system of
tactics.
abuse that had been
The complaint
ignored,
had disappeared
tolerated,
into the
or
bureaucratic
actively
void,
concealed.
dismissed for
This
lack
isn't
of
just about
corroboration.
today,
Avery said
Now
aloud
it
to
mattered.
herself. It's a
Avery
lifetime of
reviewed the
behavior.
report carefully.
Soldiers
Each line
began to speak
highlighted
quietly,
a pattern,
cautiously.
a system of
But
abuse
truth
that had
has a
been
way of
ignored,
spreading faster
tolerated,
than fear,
or actively concealed.
In the mess hall, whispers
This
became
isn't just about
conversation.
today,
Avery said
I've
aloud
seen him
to
do it
herself.
before.
It's
said
a
staff
lifetime of
sergeant.
behavior. Pulled people aside,
Soldiers began to
humiliated
speak
them
quietly,
in front of their
cautiously,
units, and
but
no one
truth
ever
has a way
said
of
anything.
spreading
Faster than fear.
He hit her, another
In the mess
officer
hall,
added.
Whispers
And she
became
didn't even
conversation.
hesitate.
That's unbelievable.
I've seen him do it before.
The
said
younger
a staff
soldier
sergeant.
stared,
But absorbing the stories,
aside,
realizing
humiliated them
something
in
they
front
had
of their
not before,
units.
and no
Courage
one
was
ever
not
said
loud.
anything. Courage could be quiet,
her,
precise,
another
and
officer
devastatingly effective.
and she didn't even hesitate.
The morale
That's
shift
unbelievable.
was subtle but unmistakable.
The younger soldiers stared,
straightened
absorbing
a little
the
more,
stories,
spoke a little more
realizing
honestly,
something they had
and
not
walked
before.
with an awareness
Courage
that the
was
old
not loud.
rules of fear no
Courage
longer
could be
applied.
quiet, precise, and
Hale,
devastatingly
meanwhile,
effective.
attempted to intervene.
The morale shift
He
was
drafted
subtle but
messages,
unmistakable.
contacted former
Soldiers
mentors,
straightened a little more,
even tried
spoke
to
a little
involve
more
the
honestly,
bases higher ups,
and walked with an
every
awareness
attempt
that
to
the
sway
old
opinion
rules
or
of fear
obscure
no
the truth
longer
failed.
applied.
Commanders,
Hale,
meanwhile,
wary now,
attempted to
the
intervene.
evidence was too clear, the
He
witnesses
drafted
too
messages,
numerous, the
contacted
soldiers
former
too attentive
mentors,
to ignore,
even tried
Hale's
to involve the
influence,
bases
once
higher ups.
untouchable, was crumbling.
Every attempt to sway opinion
A key turning
or obscure
point
the
came
truth
during
failed.
a private session.
Commanders
With the presiding
were wary
officer.
now. The evidence
Brooks
was too
entered the
clear,
room
the
alone,
witnesses
calm
too
and
numerous,
poised,
the soldiers
the
too
officer
attentive to
reviewed
ignore.
new evidence.
Hale's
Audio
influence,
recordings,
once untouchable,
witness
was
testimonies,
crumbling.
and Hale's own statements
A key
from
turning
the
point
hospital
came during a private
This
session.
is overwhelming,
with the presiding
Avery
officer
said quietly.
Brooks
We have
entered
corroboration
the room alone,
from multiple
calm
sources.
and poised.
Video,
The officer
medical
reviewed
reports,
new evidence,
testimonies
audio
from soldiers
recordings,
who are willing
witness
to speak.
testimonies.
This
and
is
Hale's
not
own
ambiguous
statements
from the hospital. Brooks nodded
This
slightly.
is overwhelming.
I want the truth
Avery
to be
said
clear,
quietly.
ma'am. Nothing
We
else
have
matters.
corroboration from multiple
Her
sources.
quiet determination
Video,
impressed
medical
even
reports,
Avery.
testimonies from
officer
soldiers who are
accustomed
willing
to
to
navigating
speak.
complex
This is not
investigations.
ambiguous. Brooks wasn't
Brooks
seeking
nodded
revenge
slightly.
or recognition.
I want the truth to
She
be
sought
clear,
accountability.
ma'am. Nothing else matters.
Back on the base,
Her
Hale's
quiet
situation
determination
worsened.
impressed even Avery.
Internal memos
a seasoned
leaked
officer
quietly.
accustomed
His
to
reputation,
navigating complex
meticulously built
investigations.
over decades,
Brooks
was
wasn't
under
seeking
scrutiny.
revenge or
Allies
recognition.
who once backed
She
him
sought
hesitated.
accountability.
Even those loyal
Back on
to
the
him
base,
began
Hale's
calculating the
situation
cost of
worsened.
continued support.
Internal memos
In the
leaked
barracks,
quietly.
whispers turned
His
to
reputation,
discussion.
meticulously
Soldiers
shared
shared
what
what
they
they
had
had seen,
seen, was
confirming
under
facts independently.
Allies who once
Even the
backed him
most
hesitated.
skeptical began to
Even
acknowledge
those loyal
Brooks'
to him began
professionalism
calculating
and
the
restraint.
cost of continued support.
One sergeant summed it up.
In the barracks,
she didn't break
whispers
protocol,
turned
she
to
didn't lose
discussion.
control.
Soldiers
Did,
shared
and
what
we
they
all
had
saw
seen,
it.
confirming facts
By the end of the week,
independently.
Hale's
Even the
position
most
was
skeptical
untenable.
began to acknowledge
The
Brooks'
investigation
professionalism
concluded its
and
preliminary
restraint.
phase.
Recommendations
summed
were
it up.
drafted.
She didn't break
Hale
protocol.
was removed
She didn't
from
lose
all
control.
command
He did,
authority,
and we
pending
all saw
formal
it.
hearings.
By
His
the end of the
career,
week,
once a
Hale's
fortress,
position
was now
was crumbling.
untenable.
Brooks,
The
meanwhile,
investigation
resumed
concluded
her
its
duties with
preliminary
caution
phase.
but confidence.
Recommendations were
She
drafted.
continued to lead her
Hale
unit,
was
drill
removed
her
from all
soldiers, and
command
oversee
authority,
operations.
pending formal
She
hearings.
didn't gloat.
His
She
career,
didn't speak of
once
the
a
incident,
fortress, was
but
now
the subtle
crumbling.
shift in her unit's
Brooks,
respect and
meanwhile,
focus was
resumed
tangible.
her duties with caution but
Soldiers
confidence.
moved with renewed clarity.
She continued to lead
Mistakes
her unit,
were
drill
corrected
her
promptly.
soldiers, and
Orders
oversee
were
operations.
executed with precision.
She didn't gloat,
and a growing
she didn't
awareness
speak of
that
the incident,
courage and integrity
but the subtle
mattered
shift
as much
in her
as
unit's
rank.
respect and focus
That
was
night,
tangible.
Brooks reflected quietly.
Soldiers moved with
She had
renewed
survived
clarity.
confrontation,
Mistakes were
injustice,
corrected
and
promptly.
intimidation.
Orders
She
were
had acted
executed with
decisively
precision
under pressure
and a
without
growing
hesitation.
awareness that courage
But she
and
understood the
integrity
cost.
mattered as much as
Careers
rank.
would be altered.
That
Loyalties
night, Brooks
tested.
reflected
The
quietly.
base would never return
She
to
had
what it
survived
been.
confrontation,
And that was the
injustice, and
point.
intimidation.
She
Somewhere
had
in the
acted
distance,
decisively
lights
under
on the
pressure
parade
without
ground
hesitation.
flickered under the desert
But she
sky.
understood the cost.
The base,
Careers
once a
would
place
be
where
altered.
fear dictated
Loyalties
obedience,
tested.
was shifting
The base
toward
would
a
never
new
understand
understanding
to what it had been.
That authority without
And that was the
accountability
point.
is fragile. And
Somewhere
courage,
in the distance,
however quiet,
lights on the
change
parade
everything.
ground flickered under the desert
Brooks allowed
sky.
herself a brief,
The base,
controlled
once a
breath.
place where fear
She had
dictated
done what was
obedience,
necessary.
was shifting
The
toward
rest,
a new
Hale's
understanding.
downfall, the
That
institution's
authority
reckoning
without
would follow its
accountability is
course.
fragile.
And courage,
And for the first
however
time in
quiet,
years,
can change
Fort
everything.
Harrington felt alive.
Brooks
By
allowed
the
herself
seventh
a
day
brief,
after the
controlled
incident,
breath. Fort Harrington was
she
a
had
different
done what was
place.
necessary.
The
The
desert
rest
sun
Hale's
rose
downfall,
over the parade
the institution's
ground, bright
reckoning,
and harsh,
would follow its
but it no
course.
longer illuminated just
And for the first
uniforms
time
and
in
formations.
years,
Fort
it
Harrington
revealed
felt
truths
alive
that had long been
By the
hidden.
seventh day after
Soldiers
the incident,
walked with
Fort
eyes
Harrington
wider,
was a
backs
different
straighter.
place. Heads held a little higher.
The desert sun rose
Respect
over
was
the
no
parade
longer
ground,
a product
bright
of fear.
and harsh.
It was
but
earned.
it no longer illuminated
Colonel
just
Marcus
uniforms
Hale
and
had become the
formations.
epicenter
It
of a
revealed
storm
truths that
he
had
could
long
not
been
control.
hidden.
Soldiers
Every
walked
call
with
he
eyes
made to
wider,
former
backs
allies
straighter.
went unanswered.
Heads held a little higher.
Emails were ignored.
Respect was
was no longer
Attempts
a
to
product
influence
of fear.
the
It was
investigation
earned.
were met with polite
Colonel
but
Marcus
firm
Hale
refusals.
had become the
His
epicenter
network,
of a storm
built over decades,
he could not control,
had dissolved under the weight
Every
of
call
evidence.
he made to former allies
The investigation
went
itself
unanswered.
had evolved into a
Emails were
formal
ignored.
inquiry.
Attempts
Lieutenant
to
Colonel
influence
Avery
the
had
investigation
compiled an
were met
exhaustive
with
report,
polite but firm
statements from
refusals.
soldiers across
His
ranks,
network, built
medical
over
reports
decades,
detailing
had
Hale's
dissolved
injuries,
under the weight of
previous
evidence.
complaints buried in
The
archives,
investigation
and
itself had
surveillance
evolved
footage that
into a
left no
formal
doubt
inquiry.
of the sequence of events.
Lieutenant Colonel Avery
The
had
pattern was
compiled an
undeniable.
exhaustive report.
Hale had abused
Statements from
authority
soldiers across
repeatedly,
ranks,
and Brooks
medical
had acted
reports
decisively
detailing
in
Hale's
self-defense.
injuries.
Previous complaints
Even the military
buried in
hierarchy
archives,
could
and
not
surveillance
ignore.
footage that left no
Hale
doubt
was
of
now
the sequence
confined
of
to his
events.
hospital room.
The pattern
Wrists
was undeniable.
immobilized.
Hale
Rage
had abused
simmering
authority
beneath the
repeatedly, and Brooks
I
had
will not
acted
be
decisively
humiliated
in
like
self-defense.
this, he told himself,
gripping
even the
bed
military
rails.
hierarchy
I will
could
make
not
them
ignore
pay.
it.
They will regret this.
Hale was now confined to
But
his
the soldiers
hospital
he
room.
once intimidated
Wrists
were
immobilized,
no longer afraid.
rage simmering beneath the
Specialist
surface.
Tours, the young soldier
I will not
who
be
had witnessed the
humiliated
slap,
like this,
spoke
he told
quietly
himself,
with a group
gripping
of
the
peers
bed
in the
rails.
barracks.
I
I
will
thought
make
no
them
one would
pay.
stand up to
They
him,
will regret
Tours
this.
said. But she
But the
did.
soldiers
And
he
now
once
we don't
intimidated
have to. We're no longer afraid.
I know,
replied Sergeant Hall,
Specialist
older and
Tours,
grizzled.
the young soldier
I've
who had
seen
witnessed
officers
the slap,
break under
spoke
fire.
quietly
I've
with a
seen
group of
soldiers
peers
panic,
in the barracks.
but she was ready.
I thought no one
calm,
would stand
precise,
up to him,
Tours
and now
said.
everyone
But
knows
she
it.
did. And now
Word
we don't
spread
have
quickly
to. through whispers and
I
hushed
know,
conversations.
replied Sergeant Hall,
By the
older and
evening,
grizzled.
morale had
I've
shifted
seen officers
entirely.
break under fire.
Soldiers
I've
who
seen
once
soldiers
soldiers at Hale's
panic,
presence
but she
now
was ready,
exchanged
calm,
glances
precise,
filled with respect
and
for
now
Brooks,
everyone knows
admiration for her composure,
Word spread
and
quickly
disbelief
through
at the
whispers
colonel's
and
hushed
fall.
conversations. The presiding
By the
officer
evening,
scheduled
morale
a
had
formal
shifted
hearing.
entirely.
It was
Soldiers
held in
who
a
once
secure
flinched at
briefing
Hale's
room
presence
with the top
now
brass
exchanged
observing.
glances filled
Soldiers
with
were
respect
allowed
for
to
Brooks,
attend as witnesses.
admiration for her
The
composure,
room was tense,
and disbelief
the
at the
air
colonel's
heavy
fall.
with anticipation. The presiding
Everyone
officer
knew the
scheduled a
significance
formal
of what
hearing.
was about to unfold.
It was held in a secure
Hale was
briefing
wheeled
room
in
with
on
the
a
top
stretcher,
brass
his
observing.
face pale, his
Soldiers
expression
were allowed
rigid.
to attend
The
as
first
witnesses.
thing he noticed was
the
the
room
attention,
was tense,
not just from the
air
officers,
heavy with
but from the
anticipation.
soldiers.
500
knew
pairs
the
of
significance
eyes,
of what
some
was
curious,
about to unfold,
some defiant,
all
Hale
attentive.
was wheeled in on a
He
stretcher.
realized that
his
for the
face
first time
pale,
in
his
decades,
expression
he
rigid.
was powerless
The
in
first
front of
thing
the
he
people who
noticed
once
was the
obeyed
attention,
without question,
not just from the officers,
Brooks
but from
entered
the
calmly,
soldiers.
standing apart from the
500
commotion.
pairs of eyes,
Her cheeks
some
still
curious,
bore a faint bruise,
some defiant,
her uniform
all
immaculate.
attentive. Her
He
posture
realized
was
that
perfect.
for the first time
she
in
didn't
decades,
speak. He was
she didn't move
powerless in front of the
unnecessarily.
people who once
She
obeyed
merely
without
observed.
question. The
Brooks
presiding
entered
officer
calmly,
standing
Hale
apart from the
first.
commotion. Colonel Hale,
Her cheeks still
you are
bore
here
a
to
faint
respond
bruise,
to
her
allegations
uniform
of abuse of
immaculate.
authority
Her
and
posture
assault.
was perfect.
You are
She
reminded
didn't
that
speak.
you may speak.
She didn't
but
move
you must be
unnecessarily.
truthful. She merely
Hale
observed.
opened his mouth, trying
The
to
presiding
project strength,
officer
authority,
addressed Hale
control.
first. But the
Colonel
words
Hale,
faltered.
you are here
His
to
past,
respond to
once
allegations
invisible,
of
now
abuse
pressed
of
against
authority
him.
and assault.
One by
You
one,
are reminded
witnesses
that you may
recounted
speak,
the events,
but you must be truthful.
Medics confirmed the
Hale
extent
opened
of
his
Hale's
mouth,
injuries.
trying to project strength,
Soldiers
authority,
testified
control.
that Brooks had acted
But the words
purely in
faltered.
self-defense. His past,
Investigators
once invisible,
presented
now pressed
prior
against
complaints,
previously
one by
ignored,
one,
witnesses
detailing a
recounted
pattern
the
of
events.
intimidation,
Medics
harassment,
confirmed
and
the
misuse
extent of
of
Hale's
authority.
injuries. The
Soldiers
evidence testified that Brooks had acted purely
Hale
in
tried to
self-defense.
interject, tried to assert his version of
presented
events,
prior complaints,
but each statement
previously
was countered
ignored,
by facts,
detailing a
documents,
pattern
and
of
recordings.
intimidation. The room
harassment,
itself
and
seemed to
misuse
tilt
of
against
authority.
him. For
The
the first
evidence
time,
was
he felt
overwhelming.
doubt. Not in the soldiers,
Hale tried to
not in the
interject,
process, but
tried
in
to
himself.
assert his version of events.
He realized
but
the
each
narrative
statement
he
was
had controlled
controlled
for
by
decades,
facts,
documents,
the one built
and
on
recordings.
fear and
The
manipulation.
room itself
was
seemed
crumbling.
to tilt against him. By the end of the
For
day,
the first time,
the
he felt
conclusion was
doubt.
clear. Not in the soldiers,
The presiding
not in the
officer's
process,
words
but in
were
himself.
simple and decisive.
He realized
Colonel
the
Marcus
narrative he had
Hale is
controlled for
relieved of
decades.
all command
The one
authority,
built on fear
pending
and
further
manipulation.
action, was
His
crumbling.
conduct violated the
By
standards
the end
of
of
the
this
day.
service,
The conclusion
he is
was
hereby
clear.
removed from his position.
The presiding
and
officer's
subjected
words
to a
were
formal
simple
review
and
of his
decisive.
career and actions.
Colonel Marcus Hale is relieved
The soldiers
of all
present
command
didn't cheer.
authority. They didn't
Pending
clap,
further
but the
action.
room's atmosphere
His conduct
shifted
violated
subtly.
the standards
Breaths
of this
were
service.
steadier. He is
Postures
hereby
relaxed.
removed from his position.
Even the most
and
cynical
subjected
officers
to a formal
understood the
review of his
significance.
career and
The
actions.
system, for once, had worked in
The
favor
soldiers
of
present
integrity.
didn't cheer. They didn't
Back
clap,
on the base,
but the
reactions
room's
were swift.
atmosphere shifted subtly.
Junior officers
breaths
shared
were
the
steadier,
news quietly.
postures relaxed.
Enlisted soldiers exchanged
Even the most
looks
cynical
of disbelief
officers
and
understood
relief.
the significance.
Word reached the
system
barracks
for
within
once
hours.
had worked in
Hale's
favor of
influence
influence.
had ended.
Back on the base,
Some soldiers
reactions
had
were swift.
anticipated Brooks' vindication.
Junior officers shared
Others
the
had
news
quietly doubted it. Enlisted
Now the doubt
soldiers
was
exchanged looks of
The truth had
disbelief
been
and
made
relief.
clear for everyone to
Word
see.
reached the barracks within
Even
hours.
more significant
Hale's
was the
influence
effect
on
on
morale. Soldiers
Some
who once
soldiers
moved
had
under fear
anticipated
now
Brooks'
moved under
vindication.
respect.
Orders
Others
had
were
quietly
executed
doubted
with
it.
precision.
Now the
not
doubt
terror.
was gone.
Mistakes
The
were
truth had
corrected
been made
with
clear
guidance,
for everyone
not
to see.
intimidation.
Even
The
more
culture of
significant
fear
was
that
the
had
effect on
permeated
morale.
Fort Harrington for
Soldiers who
decades
once
was beginning
moved under
to
fear
dissipate.
now moved under respect.
Hale's hospital
Orders
room
were
became a
executed
place
with
of
precision,
isolation, not terror.
Former allies
Mistakes
avoided
were
him.
corrected with
Requests
guidance,
for meetings
not
went
intimidation.
unanswered.
The
Even the
culture of
nurses who
fear
had
that
once
had
deferred
permeated
to his
Fort
authority
Harrington
now
for
treated
decades
him
was
as a
beginning
patient,
to dissipate.
not a commander.
Hale's
He
hospital
called
room
one of his
became
most
a
loyal
place of
subordinates
isolation.
late that night.
Former allies
"You must fix
avoided
this,"
him.
he barked.
Requests for
"I
meetings
will not
went
be
unanswered.
Even
The
the nurses
subordinate
who had once
hesitated
deferred
voiced
to his
low,
authority
"Sir,
now
it's too
treated
late.
him as a
Everyone
patient,
knows."
not a commander.
Hale's rage
He
boiled.
called one of his most
He slammed
loyal
the phone
subordinates
down,
late
breathing
that
hard.
night. "You
But he
must fix
understood
this,"
deep
he
down
barked.
that the system
"I
had
will not
shifted.
be undone." Brooks,
The
meanwhile,
subordinate
returned to her
hesitated,
quarters
voiced low.
quietly.
"Sir,
She did
it's
not
too
celebrate.
late. Everyone
She
knows."
did not announce her triumph.
Hale's rage boiled.
She allowed herself
He
only
slammed
a
the
small,
phone down,
private
breathing
moment of
hard.
reflection.
But he understood
She had
deep down
acted
that the system
decisively
had
under
shifted.
pressure. She had
Brooks,
maintained
meanwhile,
composure.
returned to her quarters
She had protected
quietly.
herself and
She did not
upheld the
celebrate.
values she believed
She did not
in.
announce her triumph.
The soldiers who had
She
witnessed
allowed
her
herself
actions
only
now
a small,
carried a quiet
private
lesson
moment
forward.
of reflection.
Authority is
She had
earned.
acted
Courage
decisively
matters,
under pressure,
and fear is
she
not
had
respect.
maintained composure.
Brooks wrote
She had
briefly
protected
in her
herself
journal
and upheld the values
Power
she
can be
believed in.
abused. Courage can
The
be
soldiers
quiet.
who had witnessed
Justice
her
is
actions
precise.
now carried a quiet
And sometimes
lesson forward.
2 seconds are
Authority
all it
is
takes to
earned.
change everything.
Courage matters.
And
That
fear
night, the
is
desert
not respect.
wind swept across Fort Harrington.
Brooks wrote briefly
Lights
in her journal.
flickered against the dark horizon.
Power can be abused.
Soldiers moved
Courage
through
can be
the base,
quiet.
talking
Justice
quietly,
is precise.
nodding to one
And
another.
sometimes 2
Exchanging
seconds are
subtle
all it takes to
signs of
change
renewed
everything.
respect.
That
The
night,
ripple
the desert
created by
wind
Brooks
swept across Fort
actions
Harrington.
would continue
Lights
far
flickered
beyond
against
the
the
immediate
dark horizon.
consequences. Soldiers moved
And Hale's
through the
fall,
base,
once
talking
thought impossible,
quietly,
served
nodding
as a
to one
stark
another,
warning.
exchanging
No
subtle
one, no matter
signs
how
of renewed
powerful,
respect.
is untouchable when the
The
truth
ripple
is
created by
undeniable.
Brooks.
The
Actions
base
would
had witnessed
continue
history
far
in its
beyond
own
the
small,
immediate consequences.
disciplined way. And
And
Hale's
at the center
fall,
of it,
once
Captain
thought
Alina
impossible,
Brooks stood
served
calm,
as a stark
composed,
warning.
and unwavering.
No one, no matter how
Her
powerful,
place had never
is
been below
untouchable
anyone.
when the truth is
It had
undeniable.
always been exactly where
The
she
base
stood.
had witnessed history in its
The
own
sun
small,
rose over Fort
disciplined
Harrington
way.
like any other morning.
And at the center
But
of
nothing
it,
felt
Captain
ordinary.
Alina Brooks stood calm.
The desert air
composed,
was
and
crisp,
unwavering.
dry, and sharp.
Her
carrying
place
a
had
subtle
never been below
electricity.
anyone.
Soldiers
It had
walked
always
across
been
the parade
exactly
ground
where she
with
stood.
purpose. Heads high,
The sun
boots
rose
striking
over
in
Fort
measured
Harrington
rhythm.
like any other morning.
There was a new energy,
but nothing felt
something
ordinary.
intangible but unmistakable.
The desert air was
the
crisp,
quiet sense
dry,
that
and
fairness,
sharp, courage,
carrying
and
a subtle
integrity had
electricity.
finally asserted
Soldiers
themselves.
walked across the parade
Captain
ground with
Alina
purpose,
Brooks walked among
heads
her
high,
unit, her steps
boots
steady,
striking in
posture
measured rhythm,
perfect, face
There
calm.
was a new energy.
Every soldier
something
under her
intangible
command
but
felt
unmistakable.
it. Authority
The
earned,
quiet
not
sense
demanded.
that fairness,
Respect,
courage,
not
and
fear.
integrity had finally asserted
This was a
themselves.
victory not just for her.
Captain
but
Alina
for every
Brooks
soldier
walked among her
who had
unit,
ever
her
felt
steps
powerless
steady,
under the
posture
weight of
perfect,
unchecked
face
authority.
calm.
Every soldier
Colonel
under
Marcus
her
Hale
command
had
felt
been
it.
permanently
Authority
relieved of
earned,
command.
not demanded.
Investigations
Respect,
had
not fear.
concluded that his career,
This was a
once
victory not
celebrated
just
for
for
decades,
but for
was
every
marred by
soldier who had
abuse,
ever felt
intimidation,
powerless
and
under the weight
misconduct.
of unchecked
All
authority.
pending evaluations.
Colonel Marcus
command
Hale had been
privileges,
permanently
and
relieved
operational
of command.
responsibilities were
Investigations
had concluded that his
Hale
career,
remained on
once
base
celebrated
only
for
temporarily,
decades,
under strict
was marred by
supervision,
abuse,
waiting for
intimidation,
formal
and
reassignment or
misconduct.
discharge.
All
He
pending
no longer had
evaluations,
influence,
command
he no longer
privileges,
had respect,
and operational
and for the first time in
responsibilities were
decades,
stripped from
he
him.
truly understood what it
Hale
meant to be
remained on
powerless.
base only temporarily.
The hospital
under
room
strict
that had once
supervision,
felt like
waiting
sanctuary
for
for
formal
him
reassignment
now felt
or
like a
discharge.
cage.
Nurses
He no longer
and
had
medics
influence.
treated him
He
professionally,
no longer
but
had
without
respect.
deference.
And for the
Former
first time in
allies
decades,
no longer
he truly
returned
understood
calls.
what it meant to be powerless.
Even the commanding officers who had
The
once
hospital
deferred to
room
him
that had
treated
once
him
felt
like
like
any other
sanctuary
officer
for him
now
now
felt
felt
like
like
privileges.
No
Nurses
special
and medics
consideration.
treated him professionally.
It was
but
a
without
collapse of a
deference.
career built
Former
on
allies no longer returned calls. Meanwhile, Brooks, even the commanding officers who had once deferred to him, Colonel Avery, like any other officer, recommended her for promotion, no special privileges, and a commendation, no special consideration. Her leadership, composure, it was a collapse of a career under pressure built on intimidation, had not only prevented potential harm, but had shifted the culture of the base. Soldiers
Lieutenant
and
Colonel
officers alike
Avery
were
formally
noticing.
recommended her for promotion.
The recommendation
and a
cited
commendation.
her exceptional
Her
courage
leadership
under threat of
composure,
physical
and
harm,
integrity under
adherence
pressure
to protocol
had not only
under
prevented
extraordinary
potential
pressure,
harm, but
and
had
unwavering
shifted the culture
commitment
of the
to the
base.
welfare of her unit.
Soldiers and officers
Brooks
alike
accepted
were
the
noticing.
commendation quietly.
The recommendation
Her
cited her
calm, measured.
exceptional
She did not
courage
seek
under
the
threat
spotlight.
of physical harm.
She had acted because it
adherence
was
to
right,
protocol,
not
under
because she
extraordinary
sought
pressure.
recognition.
An unwavering
But recognition
commitment to the
followed her
welfare of her
anyway.
unit. On the
Brooks
parade
accepted
ground,
the
a
commendation
ceremony was
quietly,
held.
her expression calm,
Soldiers
measured.
formed ranks.
She did not seek the
NCOs
spotlight.
straightened their posture.
She had acted because
Enlisted
it was
personnel
right,
watched
not
quietly,
because she sought
eyes
recognition.
wide with admiration.
But recognition
Lieutenant
followed
Colonel
her
Avery
anyway.
officiated.
On the
She
parade
spoke
ground,
not of punishment,
a ceremony
but of
was
example.
held.
Captain
Soldiers
Alina
formed
Brooks,
ranks,
Avery
NCOs
said, voice
straightened
steady,
their posture,
has demonstrated
enlisted
the highest
personnel
standards
watched
of
quietly,
military conduct,
eyes wide
courage,
with
and
admiration.
leadership. Lieutenant
She has
Colonel
upheld the
Avery
values of this
officiated.
institution
She
in the
spoke
face
not
of
of punishment,
intimidation
but of
and
example.
threat.
Let her
Captain
actions
Alina
serve as a
Brooks,
model for all
Avery
who
said,
serve
voice
here.
steady,
Has
Brooks stood
demonstrated
at
the
attention,
highest standards
expression
of
neutral.
military
The
conduct,
soldiers in the
courage,
formation,
and leadership.
500
She
of
has
them,
upheld
felt
the
the weight
values
of
of
what
this
had transpired
institution in the face of
Some remembered the
intimidation
slap.
and threat. Some
Let her
remembered the
actions
moment she had
serve as a
broken
model
Hale's
for all
wrists
who
in
serve
self-defense. All
Brooks
of them
stood at
understood
attention,
what it meant.
expression neutral.
Fear could no
The
longer
soldiers in the
dictate
formation,
respect. 500
even
of them
those closest
felt
to
the weight
Hale
of what had
had to
transpired.
acknowledge it.
Some remembered
Former
the slap.
subordinates who
Some
had once
remembered the
followed him
moment she had broken
unquestioningly
Hale's
approached
wrists
Avery
in
privately,
self-defense, confirming
all of them
testimonies.
understood what it meant.
Officers who had
Fear
hesitated
could no
to
longer
act found
dictate
their
respect.
courage emboldened by Brooks'
Even those
example.
closest to Hale
The
had to
culture of
acknowledge it.
silence, long accepted,
Former subordinates
began
who
to
had
crack.
once followed him
It was
unquestioningly
slow,
approached
imperceptible,
Avery
but
privately,
inevitable, confirming testimonies.
Back in her quarters that evening,
Officers who had
Brooks
hesitated
allowed
to
herself
act
a
found
rare
their courage
moment of
emboldened
reflection.
by Brooks' example.
She stared at her
The
reflection
culture of
in the
silence,
mirror.
long
Her cheek,
accepted, once
began to
bruised,
crack.
had faded. Her
It was
uniform
slow,
remained
imperceptible,
immaculate,
but inevitable.
But the face staring
Back in
at
her
her
quarters
was
that
not the
evening,
same one that
Brooks
had
allowed
entered the
herself
parade
a
ground
rare
a week
moment
ago.
of reflection.
It was a face
She
that
stared
had
at her
faced
reflection in the
intimidation
mirror.
and abuse.
Her cheek,
and had remained
once
calm,
bruised, had
composed,
faded.
and
Her
principled.
uniform remained
A face
immaculate,
that had acted
but the
decisively
face staring
when
back
others
at her
might have
was not the
hesitated.
same one that had
A
entered
face
the
that had
parade
changed
ground
the
a week
system,
ago.
however slightly,
It was
forever.
a face that had faced
She
intimidation
wrote in her
and
journal,
abuse,
and had
integrity
remained
is
calm,
not loud,
composed,
courage
and
is not
principled.
always visible.
A face that had
and
acted
sometimes
decisively
2 seconds
when
are
others
all it
might have
takes to set
hesitated.
things right.
A face
The
that
base
had changed
itself
the system,
began to transform,
however slightly, forever. Senior NCOs
She wrote
spoke
in her
more
journal,
openly with juniors.
Integrity
Officers
is not loud.
engaged their units
Courage
with
is not
guidance
always
rather
visible.
than intimidation.
And sometimes
soldiers
2 seconds
corrected
are all it
mistakes
takes
with
to set things
constructive
right.
feedback rather
The
than
base itself
fear-driven
began to
punishment.
transform.
A subtle shift of
Senior
power,
NCOs
respect,
spoke
and
more
accountability
openly with
spread
juniors.
like sunlight.
Officers
through the base.
engaged their units with
Fort
guidance
Harrington
rather
had
than
been tested.
intimidation.
It had been forced
Soldiers
to confront
corrected
decades
mistakes
of
with
unspoken
constructive
feedback
feedback,
rather
and in the
than
process,
fear-driven
it had
punishment.
learned a new lesson.
A subtle
Authority
shift of
without
power,
integrity
respect,
is fragile,
and accountability
leadership
spread
without
like sunlight
respect
is
through the
temporary.
base.
Courage,
Fort Harrington
even
had
from
been
one
tested.
person, can
It
inspire
had been forced
a new
to
confront decades of unspoken
Colonel Hale,
abuses.
meanwhile,
And in
had
the process,
retreated into the
it had learned
shadows
a
of
new
his
lesson.
hospital wing.
Authority without
Nursing his
integrity
pride
is fragile,
and reflecting on
leadership
the
without
consequences
respect
of
is
unchecked
temporary.
arrogance.
Courage,
He could
even
no
from
longer
one person,
intimidate.
can inspire
He could
a
no
new
longer
order.
command unquestioned
Colonel Hale,
obedience.
meanwhile, the
had
soldiers
retreated
who
into
once
the
feared him
shadows
now
of his
spoke of
hospital
him
wing,
quietly, carefully,
nursing his pride
with the mixture
and
of
reflecting
pity
on
and
the
disbelief
consequences of
that comes
unchecked
when someone
arrogance.
powerful falls from
He could no
grace.
longer intimidate.
For Hale,
He
the
could no
lesson was
longer
cruelly
command
simple.
unquestioned
No
obedience.
matter how long you
The
have
soldiers
controlled
who
others
once
feared
fear
him now spoke
one
of him
decisive
quietly,
act of
carefully,
courage,
with the
grounded
mixture
in
of
principle,
pity and disbelief
executed with
that comes
precision,
when someone
can
powerful
unravel
falls from
decades of
grace.
authority in moments.
For Hale, the lesson
Weeks
was
later,
cruelly
Fort
simple.
Harrington resumed
No matter
normal
how long you have
operations,
controlled
but
others
normal
with
was
fear.
different now.
One decisive act
Soldiers
of courage,
trained harder,
grounded
not
in
because
principle,
of fear, but because they
executed
were
with
inspired,
precision, can
Officers
unravel
led with
decades of
transparency.
authority in moments.
Commanders were held
Weeks
accountable.
later, Fort
and
Harrington
among it all,
resumed normal
Captain
operations.
Alina Brooks continued
But
her
normal
work
was
quietly,
different now.
effectively, without
Soldiers
fanfare.
trained harder, not
Her
because
story
of fear,
of
but
composure
because they
under
were
threat,
inspired,
of standing
officers
firm against
led with
intimidation,
transparency, of acting
commanders offenders were held accountable, was already being discussed quietly. Captain Alina Brooks continued her work from barracks to briefing room without fanfare, and the lesson was clear. Her story, no one is untouchable, threat, courage and
standing
integrity
firm
can
against
topple even the
intimidation,
most entrenched
of acting
power.
decisively,
Respect must be
was already
earned,
being
not
discussed
demanded.
quietly among recruits.
As the sun set over
Whispered
Fort
from
Harrington,
barracks to
the
briefing
base
rooms,
hummed with quiet purpose,
and the lesson was clear.
Captain
No
Alina
one is
Brooks stood on the
untouchable.
parade ground
Courage
one
and
last
integrity
time for
can
the
topple
day,
even the
watching
most
her
entrenched
soldiers.
power.
She did not
Respect
smile.
must be earned,
She did not
speak.
demanded. She simply observed.
As the sun set over Fort
The
Harrington,
desert wind
the
carried
base
the
hummed
dust
with
across
quiet
the empty
purpose.
drill fields.
Captain
Across
Alina
the long
Brooks stood on the
shadows
parade
of the parade ground
one last time for
and
the
in
day,
those shadows,
watching her
the soldiers who had
She did
witnessed
not
history
smile,
remembered
she did not
one
speak.
truth above all.
She simply observed.
One act of courage can
The
change
desert wind
everything.
carried the dust across
Brooks
the empty
turned and
drill
walked away,
fields,
calm,
across the
composed,
long shadows
unshaken.
of the parade ground.
A leader forged not
and
by
in those
fear,
shadows,
but by principle.
the soldiers who had
And
witnessed
in her wake,
history
a new
remembered
order
one
was
truth
quietly
above
born.
all.
One act of courage can change everything. Brooks turned and walked away, calm, composed, unshaken. A leader forged not by fear, but by principle. And in her wake, a new order was quietly born.
Muovetevi. Take over, grazie. Ma come League of Legends? Vabbè, vediamo, magari è interessante. Take over. Non dico nulla, promesso. No, no, ma sto scherzando ovviamente. Se lo dicevi la mettevo. Vedi che sei tu che sei picia. Non sfrutti le occasioni.